Hi, Eric. Welcome to Diversity in May. Welcome back. Actually, you've been given a workshop about area live regions before. So we're now looking forward to your talk about giving the users a say in how they want websites to interact with them and how they want to use it. Yeah, warm welcome. Let me start.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I've been here before, like almost 2 weeks ago, and like this is like going really quickly. So let me share my screen with the slides. Share slide sound, share video clip. So that's good. Trying to do this properly. I also put the link to the slides on the slides. So that's slides.yatil.net/user-preferences.html. And yes, the talk is called Respecting User Preferences on the Web. And I'm very happy to be here and talk about this like super important topic because yeah, there's a lot happening in that space, and I will talk about what is happening in a bit. Just a little bit of background. I am working for my own consulting firm called Outline here in Germany, and working as a web accessibility specialist with Axess Lab in Sweden. So all the Nordic relations are intact, and I also am a lecturer at the FH Joanneum in Graz, where I teach new and upcoming content strategists about web accessibility. And before, I've been mostly working with standards organizations and a nonprofit called Knowbility from the US. And yeah, so I have all the experience of working in different spaces, which is very fun. And you know, one of the things that always is in the center of the work that I do and the things that I want to teach is users. Users are important. You know, we make stuff accessible for the users, not, you know, to make some you know, algorithms or anything happy. We want to make, you know, users happy. We want them to be confident in using websites and web applications and all that jazz. So we want to make a web that is better for them. And users come in all different shapes and sizes, right? So, you know, there might be aliens among us. We don't know. It's totally a possibility. But, you know, there are people who work, you know, in different fields. So there might be academics, there might be construction workers, you know, doctors. Everyone is using it, and they have different contexts and different backgrounds. So this is super important to know when you're thinking about web accessibility, because every user is different, right? No user is the same. There is no, you can't have two users and they are absolutely the same, even if they are twins and work at the same job or something like that. They will have different accessibility needs. And this is actually backed up by a study from the US military that was conducted, I think, in the 40s or 50s, something around then, and they were basically like, okay, we want to build these like fighter planes, and we don't want to build, you know, different configurations of them. We want to have like the average plane, though, that people fit into those plane seats. And so they said, oh, we have the data here, you know, we have like all those soldiers. They need to do what we tell them. So let's measure them. And so they took, I think, over 4,000 people and measured them, and measured different different body lengths, like arm length and you know, shoulder height and all of that jazz. And they were like, okay, if we say, you know, maybe like 50% fall into a certain range, you know, we can work for that. And so they were like searching for the average man. there. And I will show a short clip of Matt Parker of the great stand-up math channel. And he basically did a long video about this, and I only show like the conclusion. And this is about like, okay, that report was done, all the measurements were taken, and this is basically the outcome. So let me know if you can hear that and if it's loud enough.
This is the report that Daniels wrote after the main results had come out, and unlike this beast, which is huge, Daniels' report is 4 pages long, including the introduction, because they were right. They tried to define what an average person was and then find them in the data, and they were very generous on average. They defined someone as average if they were within 0.3 standard deviations of the mean in either direction, and in case of
Oh, the slides are not being changed. I see in the chat. You should have seen slides changing all the time. So let me quickly reshare this. Let's unshare first. I had this once before, but I don't know why. So now you should see Matt Parker's. Oh, I think I did not click the right thing. Oh, it was already pre-selected. So let's try this. You should now see Matt Parker's face, and now I'm rewinding the video. Did that work? Yes, there I see a nod. So let's try this again.
This is the report that Daniels wrote after the main results had come out, and unlike this beast, which is huge, Daniels' report is 4 pages long, including the introduction, because they were right. They tried to define what an average person was and then find them in the data, and they were very generous on average. They defined someone as average if they were within 0.3 standard deviations of the mean in either direction, and in case of doubt, they rounded up to include more people as average. In any one measure, anything between 25 to 30% of people counted as average. But when they tried to find someone who was average on just 10 different measurements, it didn't work. 1. Of the original 4,063 men, 1,055 were of approximately average stature. Of those 1,055 men, 302 were also of approximately average chest circumference. Of them, 143 were also of approximately average sleeve length on blah, 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 blah. And eventually we have, well, after 9 measurements, there are 2 people left. And of those, unfortunately, 0 were also of approximately average crotch length. Which is different to crotch height. That was earlier. There you go. Okay, so concludes today's reading. There it is, the one example Daniels put in their report, and it's all they needed because it proves their point perfectly.
Okay, that proved their point perfectly. This proves my point that I should never use video in my slides, which is good. I'm now changing the browser that I use so that I hope this works better with changing slides, because if you can't see the slides, this would be super boring. Not that we couldn't make it work, but so technology is great. So you should now see slides changing. Does that work? I hope so. All right. So thanks, Matt. So basically, they looked at the data and basically were narrowing it down and saying like, oh, you know, this many people had this in common, and then this many people had that in common, and then they came out that 0 people had more than 9 things in common, like measurements of their bodies. So designing for like the average person. Super hard to do, actually quite impossible. So now you should see a slide that says, why do we design like they are? Like, shaking head. Why is this not working? This is annoying. This always worked. Let me see. I share the screen but without sound and do not optimize for video. Does that do it? So now you should see the why do we design like they are slide. And now I'm changing the slide to say, yay, we got it. Technology. Why do we develop like they are? So why do we design and develop like people are average, like we have common things? Yes, getting into the stride here. Fixing all the tech issues on the fly. So the question is, so we often, and especially on the web, but in many different parts of design, we try to pretend like we know what our user is, the average user, the prototypical user, our user that we want to support. And in reality, everyone is different. So what in that context does inclusive design even mean? What do we think? How can we define inclusive design in that context? And for me, this inclusive design context means that every user is interacting with the browser, but the browser is also interacting with the user by shaping the way the web works for that individual user. So they can basically have an adapted view. And we can see that in things like screen readers. They already work like that, and they are also basically user agents, browsers. And there are differences between them, and that's totally fine. So, for example, there has been a big brouhaha a couple of years ago now, in 2019, where Scott O'Hara, who is like great and always on top of things, found something that he was curious about. So he was looking at, how does lists work, like basic HTML lists, how do they work in different screen readers, and what are we looking at? And he found out that VoiceOver in Safari remove lists element semantics when list style none is used. So it would not announce like there are 3 list items and you're in list item 1 of 3. And so that means in a practical terms, this is a list like with the bullet points, but once you remove the bullet points, Safari is like, oh no, these are now paragraphs, they have no lists. And our web developers were like, what is going on? What's happening here? We don't like this. We specified this as a list, even if it doesn't look like a list. We want this to be read like a list. And the slide shows 3 different Doctor Who's all saying like, what? It's probably unfair to Doctor Who to equate them with all web developers. And then James Craig from Apple replied, this was a purposeful change due to rampant listitis by web developers. So web developers have been using lists all over the place. And the idea was that, this was making a lot of noise for screen reader users. So they were putting in these heuristics to say like, is this really a list? Do we really need to announce that? And web developers were like, no, hang on a second. This is not what we defined, And then they immediately asked, but what does that mean for me as a web developer, that there is this difference, that Safari doesn't do that? And I think the right answer is, nothing. It means nothing for you as a web developer. You provide that information, and then some screen readers, most screen readers use it. Some screen readers don't. That's totally a thing that can happen. We can't assume that every screen reader has the same output. And when we look at the timeline of those changes, of this like semantics removal or whatever you want to call it, we see that the first commit to this feature was done in 2014, and then it was updated in 2015, and then nothing happens, and nobody even noticed it until 2019 when all of the web used it, noticed it. So what does that mean? Maybe it's not that important that there is list semantics on every list. And James Craig again said, customers seemed much happier in the 3 years since this change went in. Now we can't, we need to take him by the word because we can't do user research on the Safari, Apple voice over customers. But they really had complaints of people using their browsers and saying like, oh, I want an option or a setting or just, get rid of those extraneous lists. And we have this in responsive web design where we basically ask ourselves, does every website need to look the same in every browser? And there is a handy website that answers that question called Do Websites Need to Look Exactly the Same in Every Browser.com? And the answer is no. And there's like a big no in the middle of it. And the same is true for screen readers. Do we want to wait a second? Oh, there we go.
Okay.
So you can really, in detail, select the verbosity for different things and also default verbosity. So users are, especially of screen readers, but also other users are used to being able to control a lot of those things. And for example, here with heading, they can even say, oh, I want the status and the type before the name. So it's heading level 1, main page instead of main page heading level 1. So you can really, really design that to your needs and make it easier for you. Yeah, and then there's more stuff. The verbosity settings, they have like many subtabs. One is that, for example, repeated punctuation, setting it to only repeat for 3 times. So even if you get like a really angry message, it has a lot of exclamation marks. It will only read the last 3 exclamation marks and then it does not read the rest. You can speak the attributes when you encounter a misspelled word in your word processor. That all can be configured so you can say, okay, this is the least friction in my screen reader. And then you can also do things like, substituting GIF with GIF, which would be wrong, but yeah, you can do that, and even like set the pronunciation for individual words. And I think the bottom line of this is there is literally no control and you have to deal with it. And the animated GIF here is 3 classic doctors putting on sunglasses and having the words deal with it on top of it. I had the ARIA live regions talk, and ARIA can help with those circumstances a bit. So you can set, very explicitly, oh, this is really a list if you want to. But one of the problems or challenges with ARIA is that it is only available in screen readers for the most part. And accessibility is not only screen readers. So yeah, you can, override some things, make them more specific. But with ARIA, you don't hit a lot of people using assistive technologies or, people who are not using assistive technologies. And most non-screen reader assistive technology does really terribly with ARIA. I put in what Dragon Naturally Speaking supports, which is like 4 roles and ARIA label, which is not a lot. And this is data from 2014. They have never really released like a compatibility table, so people don't know if they actually do support more since then. And now they were bought by Microsoft, so my hope is that the support will be improving, but it's like, there's nothing you can rely on in terms of ARIA support. But there are a couple of other things that you can that users can do to make web browsing more to their liking or better work for them. And one that we always hear about because it's a little bit funny because it has been confined to that one platform is basically high contrast mode or Windows high contrast mode. And that is a mode of the operating system. So you go into your, operating system preferences and you click enable high contrast mode, and it changes the whole contrast of your whole operating system. And that affects the web if you're using compatible browser, which is all Chromium, and Firefox is also supporting it. So there's a good support for that. And that does funny things. So if you look at this image, it has a lot of links in there, and only on the top left there are real links. Then there's a placeholder link without an href, a link made out of a div with ARIA, one made out of a button with ARIA, and then there's a paragraph of text that is not underlined with an ARIA link inside. And if you set high contrast mode, what it does, it overrides all the colors on the website and basically says, 4 different user interface elements, we have predefined, pre-specified colors that are used. So in this theme of this example, that is yellow, and despite some of the links are underlined because that was specified in the CSS. Only like the real links get the yellow color, and in the paragraph of text, because that was not underlined, it is even like invisible. You can't even see the link text because all link text gets basically reset to the link text color. All other text gets set to the base color of the normal text of the page. And that means even if you put ARIA on your links, even if you do all of that work, people with high contrast mode will not benefit in their context. And then if you have a button that looks like this in high contrast mode, so if you're using ARIA disabled, it will do nothing because high contrast mode does not understand ARIA at all. But if you have an actually disabled button, you get this green, like lower contrast version of it. And this is just one of the color modes, and this is called high contrast mode. You can also do low contrast themes. I think this is now called contrast themes in some version of Windows. But if you're looking for high contrast mode, Windows high contrast mode, you get more search engine results. And that brings us back to users and how they are interacting. So a user first has to also know that they have all these options right, and the user might have variable levels of knowledge of their AT, of their assistive technology. And there is a wide spectrum there, only because you can set all those verbosity settings, many users will not. It's like people don't know that they can increase the font size on websites. A lot of people do, but many people don't. So you have to be aware of that, and that's why you want to use a decent font size in the first place. Users often don't know what their computers can do for them, but there's such a variety in there. I have seen people hack websites and assistive technology to work with inaccessible websites. I had one colleague at W3C who wrote like big CSS and JavaScript things to change the GitHub website when it was less accessible as it is now. So he was basically like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this. I need to make this accessible." And then he wrote the scripts and the CSS that he needed to make it work. And so, yeah, that's a wide variety of how people can do it. And so if you're thinking about users, you have to keep in mind the matrix of like, oh, they might have a disability, so disability type, their proficiency with the technology, and then the accessibility support of that technology as well. Because as we have seen in the Dragon Natural Speaking, there might be no accessibility support for a certain technology. And users are getting more tools for making the web their own, which is like really needed. One of the biggest changes over the last couple of years, last half century. Oh yeah, that also, but half decade. It's still very early. Was the introduction of reader mode, which was first introduced in Safari, I think in 2010. I have a slide coming up, so I could have just waited to say that. And this is really nice because it basically allows you to say, oh, I have a consistent way of reading the page all the time, no matter on what website I am. And that, can be super beneficial. And you just click like the little reader icon, and then you go into reader mode. And you can change, font size and the colors and the font that is used, and that, gives you all the customization options. And yeah, Safari has that since 2010. And you can set it to default since 2015. So you can say, if I get to this page that I don't like the layout of, I always want to use reader mode, which is super useful. And Firefox and Edge basically added their different reader modes in 2015. They are also very good. They have even text-to-speech synthesis. And then there's Chrome, which has a reader mode behind a flag, which is very basic. And they said it comes soon, but that was also 3 years ago. So yeah, maybe they don't really like that it hides ads, which, in the end, Google as an advertisement company is probably more hesitant to put in modes that do not show ads. And then users can do more with website settings. I already talked about reader mode. So this is a screenshot from Safari again, where you can basically say, when I visit this website, in this case Medium, I want to use reader mode when available. I want to use my content blockers, so my ad blockers and tracker blockers. And I want to set a default page zoom, which in this case is 100%. But if that was not enough, I can say, oh, this page is always too small for me. Let's always crank that up to 120%, font size. So that's useful. You can select if you want to autoplay audio and video. You can block pop-up windows. I think that's the default setting to block them. And in there, you can also say oh, never ask me about camera, microphone, and location access, which some websites do, and some even for good reason. And this gives every user the way to say oh, this website, I want this to always look like this, and have the settings for each individual website. And then you can go into settings and see all the different websites and their settings. So, for Giphy, for example, those are animated GIFs. If I go there, I probably want to see the animation. I never want to see animation on basically any other website. And you can set that as the default, and then if you want a different outcome, you can select that from the list or from the drop down. And that's super useful. And so you have to keep, if you're developing a website, you have to keep in mind that a user might say, don't autoplay this video. And if you rely on a video having no play button and autoplaying to, let's say, explain functionality on the site, you might run into problems with that. So don't do it. Just not very helpful advice. I realize that, but yeah, just put a tiny little play button somewhere that is accessible and that people can use to actually play your video. And then you can leverage operating system preferences. And this is basically the need for people to not only configure their web experience, but also their rest of the operating system experience. So, for example, how applications look, what they can do, having contrast there. And on macOS, you have, invert colors, reduce motion, using grayscale, increasing contrast, reducing transparency, and what I always have checked on all my devices is differentiate without color, because that makes like these little switches having, text labels, which is, I think it's super useful. So you get these like different settings in the operating system that work for all application, but they are also adapted to the web. And the most prominent feature, or the feature most people know about, is the prefers reduced motion media query, which you can basically use to stop and pause animations from happening on the page. So in contrast to things like Windows High Contrast Mode, which just does stuff to your website, and you can't and in the grand scheme of things, you shouldn't like interfere with this. This is different. So this says, there's a preference here to reduce the motion, so you can make the decision what should happen. Sometimes you want to remove the element entirely. Sometimes you want to set the animation to the last step. Sometimes you want to set it to the first step. There's no like one way to do it because of, animations are complex, and sometimes it makes more sense to have them like, what is the static version of this animation can be an important thing to think about. The better way to do this, by the way, and this is like really like the, sledgehammer approach of like, we're not transitioning or animating anything in CSS now, is to say, okay, only if there is no preference set for reduce motion, I will animate anything. So that way you're building the static version first, and then if there is no preference for reducing motion, you say, and this is how the animation should work. And then, you basically have these two states, and it's really easy to distinguish. And that gives you the additional benefit of also catering to Internet Explorer users who if you support them at all, of course, but they will see the non-animated version because they don't understand the media query. And that basically means that you reduce their like CPU and stuff like that, which, Internet Explorer, very old browser, running out of like support in, a couple of weeks, but people are still using it. And if you give them like the reduced motion variant, they might have an easier way to get to the content there. On Windows, unfortunately, all things are complicated, so checking a reduced motion checkbox unfortunately doesn't do it. There is like a cascade of different settings that you can check and uncheck, and some trigger prefers reduced motion and some do not. It's not super interesting, I think, to do that. But if you want to know how that works, Patrick Lockie from the Pagano group did a great blog post on that, and I can recommend that. And he goes in all the details. Then there is things like prefers color scheme media query, which is basically dark mode. So we can say, oh, if someone is using dark mode, which I have done in all the screenshots today, then I'm going to reflect that on the website. So that means using your own colors, using your own branding, but with like dark mode in mind, and that's awesome. And this like setting will not override your normal CSS. So you don't run into like, oh, now I've selected dark mode and my backgrounds are all black and my colors, my fonts are all white. No, you have to specify that in your CSS by yourself. And yeah, support is very good. Again on that. But there's more coming. So these are going into a little bit more of experimental content that is coming into CSS mostly. Yeah, and this is going to be excited because you will be able to do more with your code reacting to those user preferences. So one is inverted colors media query, which you get the values non and inverted. So the idea is that, for example, if you have a design system and someone selects inverted colors, all your brand colors would be off, right? And with this media query, you can either uninvert it, or you can say like, oh, this needs more contrast on the background. I'm reacting to that. And this is already working in Safari on macOS and iOS. And it's a nice way to say, okay, if there is inverted colors, what can I do to add to that? Then there is a prefers contrast media query, which basically says, oh, I want to have more contrast than the default or less contrast than the default, or I have no preference. And this is also experimental. It's supported in Blink and Safari, so that means Chrome and Edge and all of these things. I don't know if there is a setting in the operating system or in the browser to trigger this at this point in time. But theoretically, you can use this media query and already say, oh, I have like a high contrast theme that, you know, goes to the 7:1 brand colors instead of the 4.5:1 WCAG 2 AA brand colors. If someone asks for more contrast, and then with less contrast, you can say, oh, there is like a low contrast version that I also can roll out, because some people have issues with high contrasting text on backgrounds. Then there's forced colors media query. And this is interesting because this is basically what was Microsoft high contrast media query. And the idea is that you can actually detect if high contrast mode is on for the user, and then, you know, again, if you have a design system, you might want to say, oh, we have different things. But going back to our like link example, you could say, oh, if forced colors is on, I will underline my pseudo links inside of the text, because now I know about this. You will not be able to set colors because the high contrast mode is overwriting all of that. But this gives you a way to like better react to those high contrast settings. And I think it's important to remember that user preferences come in different combinations. So, you know, someone who uses high contrast mode probably also has a higher like font size and or is zoomed in, or uses, you know, wants higher contrast, like, well, with high contrast mode, probably not. But several different things. Doesn't want to have like motion because they are very close to the screen, and if you have like big motion in your eyesight, that can make you dizzy. You want to let users decide which tool they use, including assistive tech. And this is something that I always see, or that I often see from web developers who say like, yeah, can't we just say, oh, use JAWS with our website, or use this this combination of screen readers and browsers? No, you should keep that open. Make sure that users can actually interact with any assistive technology, with any browsers that they feel the need. You want to describe and not prescribe the user interface. And that means if I have a button, I use the button element. I don't try to create that from scratch. I don't want to say like, oh, this has to look like this. The font size has to be like this. You want to be prescriptive, descriptive, and say like, oh yeah, this is the navigation, this is the main content, and then users can adapt to that. And you want to support existing conventions and defaults. So that means especially things like making sure that your navigation works in a certain way, and that you don't like override things and make them too specific to your app, because that can be hard for people to use. Yeah, and that brings us to the last slide and the end of the talk. And if there are, I don't know if we want to do questions, or if there are any.